Jen Gerson, the week after, well, not even the week after the week of the election, but it's way at the end of it. I wanted to start talking with you about the Alberta election, but I actually think we have to start with just what broke in the last couple of hours. So the funny thing is, we actually had to delay recording this. We were planning on recording this hours ago, but then I had a few things pop up, so I
And then
bumped
I had a
you.
few things pop up, and then I
Exactly.
basically fell asleep at like noon and crashed for 3 hours straight. And I had one of those series of dreams, I don't know if you've had this, where you wake up in the dream and you're like, oh, I'm in my bed and I'm awake now. I should probably get up, but I'm too tired. And then you fall back asleep, and then you actually wake up and you realize that you're waking up in the dream was actually still a dream.
I have what I understand is an unusual degree of consciousness while sleeping.
You're a lucid dreamer.
Not always lucid dreamer per se, so much as I'll be like, well, this is an amusing dream and I'm going to just sit back and enjoy it. I don't know if I can change the trajectory of it, but I'm often aware while I'm dreaming that I'm dreaming. So what broke in the last couple of hours, and we would have missed it if we had actually recorded this thing when we intended to, is that David Johnston, the independent special rapporteur, has retained Navigator, which is a Toronto-based, I don't even know exactly how to describe
crisis PR firm, but it's also a PR firm. It's a full service shop essentially.
Yeah, but it also it's a full service comms and publicity shop with a special expertise in handling catastrophes.
And basically you can't be a good Canadian scandal unless you've hired Navigator at this point.
Like, we've got Navigator now.
It's Canadian scandal bingo.
David Johnston is
We've got the bingo. We've got the bingo. We've got the Supreme Court. We've got the retired Supreme Court justice weighing in. We've got the eminent reporter weighing in, and now we've got Navigator. We've got the bingo, baby.
I was going to say probably we need to throw in a Quebec outraged angle, but David Johnston sort of having to answer some of the questions in English because his French wasn't strong enough. Maybe that kind of gives us a token ticking of the box. You know what? I'll say this. I am still less freaked out by David Johnston's role in this, and I think a lot of my peers are. But at a certain point, someone's got to tell him you're too radioactive to do this. And I know that
that point was when Parliament literally voted to kick him out of his job.
Kick him out.
Because I think that's the purpose of your job is now null and void if Parliament has voted against you.
Yeah, no, I know.
It's done now.
And I know the counter argument, and I get it. Like, there's a degree of, I don't know if I want to call it moral hazard or reinforcing bad or rewarding bad behavior, but there is an argument to be made that no one is going to be satisfactory here, and that the Conservatives will just dig in and fight anyone here. I think that could actually be true, but if they try it again, they're going to look like morons doing it the second time. There was enough on Johnston that the Conservatives were able to get some actual hits. And if they hadn't, Johnston would not have been so pissy in his first press conference, and he would not be retaining Navigator.
This is messed up priorities. The purpose of the exercise is not to placate the Conservatives. The purpose of the exercise is to get to the truth of the situation. Ultimately, who cares whether or not the Conservatives dig in or continue to oppose it? That's their job. They're opposition. They're doing their job.
I think you're wrong, actually.
The purpose of the exercise, if you are in government, is to get to the bottom of the issue and get to the truth of the issue, and to make public as much of that as is humanly possible to allow the Canadian electorate to decide.
Sort of. I think you're missing the element that there should actually be some element of this that is also a unifying thing. Not like a touchy-feely, let's all talk on Oprah's couch unifying thing, but like a consensus report. Well, a report that could build consensus.
But the problem is that you're taking the liberal talking point and you're allowing it to frame your thinking on this issue. If the purpose of this issue is, oh, well, we are going to go through this process, and if there's no point going through a transparency or accountability process because nothing you do will ever please the Conservatives, then you've given yourself an out. There's no point in ever going through a transparency or accountability process anyway, under any circumstance, and you can always pin the blame on that for the disingenuousness of the Conservatives.
No, I think you're wrong. I think you do it anyway.
No, exactly. You do it anyway because your duty is actually to the Canadian public and to the truth of the Canadian public's right to know. And if the Conservatives aren't placated by that, fine. So what? Who gives a shit? Ultimately, your duty is to the public.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I don't think you're wrong, but I also think you've leapt to concluding what I was actually about to say.
Well, I'm a little bit excitable at the moment. I just came off an election, Matt.
I think you do. I think you do it anyway, but I think you have a stronger case the second time you do it. Where like, okay, Conservatives, the first guy wasn't good enough. Here's the second guy. What are you going to hate this guy for? Part of this process has to be doing it in a way where the public can have reasonable confidence in the outcome. It can't, like, you cannot just go YOLO, it's a shit show, but who cares?
But you can't hire a special rapporteur. You can't go through this process again because your credibility was shot with the first one. The only path forward here is the public inquiry.
Yep.
Or you have to just choose to shut it down and say, what are you going to do, NDP? Call a confidence motion?
Yeah, but even the public inquiry has someone at the head of it. And the question then would be, would the Conservatives also hate that person?
Well, then that way you need to actually work with, it's called working with the Conservatives and working with the opposition to find an appropriate judge or person to have helm that inquiry and to announce them ideally in tandem.
Because, well, especially in a minority parliament, but I'm not convinced the Conservatives want to play ball with this. I think the Conservatives quite like the status quo.
Maybe they do.
I'm not convinced the Conservatives want a public inquiry. I think they like being able to demand one every day.
Fair enough, but the Conservatives are not in government. They're not the ones ultimately accountable for what's going on in government. So I refuse to blame shift, as the Liberals often do. I refuse to blame shift lack of accountability measures onto the people who aren't actually in power. The people in power here are the Liberals. Their duty is to the public and to us in the public. We have a right to know what the hell is going on, and they have the right to provide that information in good faith, regardless of whether or not the Conservatives are assholes.
Yeah, that's true. But the problem is I'm not convinced that the Parliament, which is also part of the government, which is also part of this process, is not going to be completely obstructionist. I just don't have any faith in any of them to pull this off. POEC was an interesting example because it did work fairly well.
They are, yes. POEC would demonstrate to us that there is value in the public inquiry, and I can't remember who made this point. Maybe it was you, but essentially, all of the information and data we're getting right now that demonstrates the sheer dysfunction of the government suggests to us that more public inquiries are required and not fewer.
Oh God, we should be having 5 public inquiries a year for the next 10 years
100%,
on everything.
Yes, because that's the only way we're going to get to the bottom of what the hell is going on in our government. And bluntly, we pay these fuckers. We've got the right to know.
Well, they would say we don't.
Yeah, well, fuck them. Anyway, I'm in a mood today.
That's not that unusual.
No, it's not.
I think the other fun thing about Johnston this week, and I mean to conclude the thought, Johnston I think has to realize at this point he's radioactive. You're
hiring Navy Navigator. It's time to go.
Yeah, but I don't think that's necessarily a reflection on him. I don't know if anyone would have been good enough to do this job short of like Stephen Harper himself.
I think that is 100% a reflection on him, his decision to take the job and his handling of this entire inquiry. I think he handled the inquiry
badly.
Poorly. I think the investigation was lacking, and then I think his demand to trust me in the end was utterly tone deaf and actually not in keeping with I don't know, some basic concepts of government and civil service. So no, sorry, brought this all on himself. And the fact that the taxpayer is footing the bill for the Navigator PR help is just the icing on the goddamn cake of this.
Well, it's like I said,
shit sandwich.
Like I said to you last week, Johnston, I don't think understood what he was walking into. Like, I think that is visibly a man out of step with the tenor of the times. Did you read Shannon Proudfoot this week in the Globe?
I kind of skimmed it, but I didn't get into it.
I thought it was excellent.
What did she write again? I forget.
Just as kind of as someone who is not come up and is not conversant in Laurentian isms, that like watching David Johnston's reaction to this was kind of like, does he think it's normal that Canadians just sort of share their cottage time with past and future prime ministers? And I think like, and I thought Shannon's piece was so bang on, first of all, because something you and I have said a billion times here in different contexts is that there's a segment of the Canadian elite that is not keeping up with developments, that has not read the winds as things have been changing lately. And I think Shannon's a very good entry in that.
Yeah, but I also look at someone like Andrew Coyne. It's not like Andrew Coyne wasn't saying before the inquiry, Johnston, you're not the appropriate person for this role. Andrew Coyne is about as Laurentian consensus as it gets here, man. So I don't really give him that much credit for just being out of step. Like, it's not like he was only getting feedback from the crazies out west. Like,
I think Johnston's in his 80s and Coyne is not. And I think that explains a lot. At a certain point.
70s?
Pardon me?
Coyne in his 70s?
No, and he's probably going to hunt you down and find you for saying that. I don't recall how
Sorry.
old he is, but it's nowhere near that.
He's not young.
No, but I mean, there's a difference between like adult and octogenarian. And there's a time where I just don't think Johnston was. He shouldn't have taken the job. I agree with that entirely, but I've been kind of wincing a little bit watching him do that. There's an old Kids in the Hall clip where it's an old like skit, which is like a guy just completely getting his ass kicked in a bar fight, and like everybody's telling him like stay down. Like that's, and the idea of the clip, of course, that he doesn't, and he just repeatedly gets his ass kicked. I was thinking of that this week, looking at Johnston just get punched in the face. Like, it's like, dude, like back out. Like, just put out a statement, go, it's become clear to me that I will not be able to fulfill my role, blah, blah, blah. Get the hell out. But just throw this grenade back at the prime minister. Make this his decision again. He's not doing it. Shannon's column, which I would recommend everybody read, was a really, first of all, it was incisive, but it was also funny. Like, it was just a skewering of a, do these people think this is normal? And I may not be as Laurentian as David Johnston or perhaps even Andy Coyne, but I'm Laurentian enough that when I told you this in our podcast last week, when he was doing his press conference, I was like,
You're 30% Laurentian consensus monster, which puts you in a different perspective on some of this stuff.
To me, what he was doing was familiar enough that I could recognize it, but at least I wouldn't do it. Now, maybe by the time I'm 81, I would. You know what I mean? Like, I think people get fossilized, like in their old age, right? Like it's harder for them to see certain things. But it wasn't like I wasn't viewing it as far on the outside as Shannon was. I was viewing it enough of the inside to kind of, it's gonna sound terrible, but like I remember being at a really fancy restaurant once, and there was someone there who had a lot of money, and he was being terrible to the waiter, and it pissed me off because it was just this idea of this person does not have a billionth of your social capital and wealth, and you will treat them with manners.
Yes,
but they just didn't get it. And David Johnston telling Canadians to just trust him read to me a little bit as not being like, not berating the waiter, but just not thanking them. It's just taking their hard work for granted. Like, there has to be a degree of awareness and goodwill that goes along with all the perks, and I don't think Johnston has demonstrated that in recent weeks. You know what, I'm with you though. I think by the time you've brought in Navigator, has Navigator actually successfully ever gotten anyone out of a problem?
You know, I think that if they had, it was the type of problem that you and I have never heard about, and that was their duty and that was their job, and they did it. The problem, I can't comment on Navigator's record because I mean we only really pay attention.
We only know about the public stuff.
Yeah, we only know about the public stuff. We only pay attention really to the outliers.
Well, it's like the spies say, right? You never know about the attacks we prevent.
Yeah, exactly. So like I can't speak to Navigator's capacity or talent at all. I mean,
that's funny.
I mean, they must be good at what they do. They're still around. They're still kicking around. But it does seem that by the time it is news that you've hired Navigator, Navigator can no longer help you. I think that's it. Like, if you could still keep the fact that you've hired Navigator on the down low, you're probably fine. But the second like a headline comes out that says Jen Gerson has hired crisis communications firm Navigator, you know I'm fucked.
Yeah. No, I think you're right about that.
This is the moment when McInerney's like, I've had a long and fruitful business relationship with Jen Gerson for many years, but upon reading these latest Twitter comments, we've decided to part
ways amicably. I wish her all the best in her future. Yeah, you're probably right. But I'm also, I mean, taxpayers are on the hook for this, which means we have a right to know I
Yes.
mean, well, it's Canada. There's a total transparency void. We have the right to know nothing. Do you want to talk about Alberta? And I know like the election's days behind us, and I know you've already written your column for the Line this week about that. But there actually was some data trickling out near the end of this week that I don't fully understand. You kind of told me the top level findings of this. What was the data coming out later this week that you thought was interesting about the Alberta election?
Okay, well, speaking of Navigator, I happened to do a panel this morning. It was just how to say this, expert panel. I mean, I basically never say no to these things, right? So they had like a morning panel where they did some research and then released it, and then they got me and Deb Yedlin essentially to comment on the research. And really, really interesting research. There have been a couple other post-election polls to come out that track sort of public sentiment as well. I think Greg Lyle did some as well. So I'd like to just sort of sum these up because some of them are really fascinating. They basically found that how should I say this? I think the UCP got a little over 50% of the popular vote,
Yeah,
but
no, it had outright majority support. I checked that.
outright majority support. But post-election, it looks like actual satisfaction in the outcome of the election is less than 40%, which means they essentially lost.
So 20%
to,
of their voters aren't happy they won.
yeah, pretty much. It looks to me like also Danielle Smith is not popular. Her party is much more popular than she is. The opposite is still strongly true of Notley. Notley herself is very popular. The NDP is wildly unpopular. There's a lot of concern in Alberta that a lot of the more ideological pet projects of the conservative parties right now, for example, creating an Alberta RCMP or creating an Alberta CPP, which all go back to the firewall letter and the fair deal panel and the whole deal. This stuff is huge in conservative circles, and it's just totally not a priority for most Albertans. Like it's single digit priority for the vast majority of Albertans. So there's a real sense that there's a disconnect between the priorities of the incoming government and the priorities of what Albertans give a shit about. Albertans give a shit about healthcare situation, affordability issues, economic issues, the same as the rest of Canada is basically. Like nobody gives a fuck about your little firewall letter. Like nobody gives a shit about stuff like that. But there's a real concern that that's the stuff that the Conservatives are going to focus on. All of this sets Danielle up for a very bad time, either in caucus or in her party, because it means that there's going to be a significant split of opinion and views about what the priorities of the government should be between her caucus, between her party, and between the electorate writ large. The closer you get to the Danielle land, the more ideologically conservative it is, and the further away you get from that land, it gets less ideologically conservative. This is not an unbridgeable gap, but it's a problem. Most Albertans actually, funnily enough, aren't interested in a fight with Ottawa right now. There's no appetite for that at the moment. However, a fight with Ottawa is one of the ways which conservative leaders have traditionally managed to galvanize fighting bitchy caucus and electorate. So we'll see how this might be a moment when if Trudeau hands Danielle a gift, she will hand Alberta. Sorry, if Trudeau hands Alberta, an emissions cap or some ridiculous thing on nat gas, as we're kind of expecting him to do, that will be a gift for Danielle because that will galvanize the electorate and her caucus behind her in a really significant way. But right now, Alberta has no interest in this. Like it's just not there. It's not on the radar. And then the other interesting thing that came out of this data was the fact that Navigator's been tracking UCP dissenters. So these are people who voted UCP in the last election, but weren't planning on voting UCP in this election. And last fall, that was about 18% of the overall population. That would
have been the Kenney election, right? So 18% of the people who voted for Kenney were not planning on voting UCP this time,
or were wary, sort of thing.
Okay,
and that was basically their dissenter group, which they had subgrouped within their data research. And they found that by the time we got to the election, 9% of those people, about half those dissenters, came home to the UCP. The other half probably didn't vote, or they just disappeared or whatever. And then the NDP managed to gain as good an outcome as it did, not by convincing those UCP dissenters, but rather by cannibalizing the centrist Alberta Party and Liberal Party, which don't exist as entities and haven't for years. But essentially, they took the last pretend support that those groups had, and brought them into the NDP fold.
Mhm.
So what that tells me is that the actual number of centrists in Alberta is not actually that high, which is interesting to me, because if you asked Albertans themselves to track where they sit on a scale of 1 to 10 between left and right, you'll get a very standard distribution. Most people on average peg themselves a 5. They say, I'm a centrist. But if you're pegging a centrist by how they actually vote and behave at the voters booth, the number is probably closer to 20%.
Well, I
which
mean,
is
that
not
kind of explains what the first thing you noted, right? That no one's happy with the result, because you might actually have a large number of centrists reluctantly parking their vote with one option or another
100%.
that they don't like.
And in a two-party system, essentially what that suggests is that, frankly, there aren't enough actual voting centrists to create an independent party. It's not there. But that 20% is going to decide whether or not the future majorities go to the UCP or the NDP.
And then they're going to hate it either way.
But precisely, that's what being a centrist is. That's what democracy is. It's just making sure that everybody has their equal share of misery. So there's that data. It's worth, and it's interesting. It's worth a wrap up. There's also some really interesting data coming out from about how NDP supporters are going to manage Rachel Notley, because of course this is now a second unsuccessful election in a row. There's nobody stacked up to replace her, but essentially the NDP, if they don't start thinking about succession planning and future forward planning, they risk turning Rachel Notley into another Elizabeth May, right? Where this is just the Elizabeth May party. This is just
she runs in every election and she loses,
runs in the
but
election
she just always has a job.
But she always has a job, but everybody really likes her. She gets on the cover of Maclean's all the time, but I mean, she can't win. Like that becomes
and she goes on all the panels and wins Parliamentarian of the Year over and over.
And it becomes, a personality cult around her, right? So this is kind of some of the interesting data that's come out. I think it's maybe worth parsing a little bit. I don't want to get into it. I don't want to write another column on it, but it's worth, I think, that the smattering of post-election polling has actually been really interesting to watch. But anyway, that's just me rambling about wonky nerd stuff.
On the Alberta election front, I as an editor, it's funny to see people think the Line is a right-leaning publication. You and I are right-leaning, but we're actually pretty open-minded to taking arguments from anywhere, as long as they're good. And I don't feel the need as an editor to put my thumb down on the scale. And this week, we ran late last week we ran Ken Bosencool on why he wouldn't vote, and then earlier this week we ran on election day itself Sabrina McPherson rebutting Ken and making the argument of why you should vote. And I kind of read both of them and I was like, okay, these are what these people think, and I didn't have any strong feelings about them either way beyond thinking, okay, like these are interesting essays and I think people will enjoy them. And what surprised me was that I think Sabrina, just looking at the reaction, including replies we as the editors get, looking at the emails we get, I think Sabrina had by far the more popular take, kind of a defense of the civic duty of voting. And it just struck me as interesting, because even though I said a minute ago I didn't have strong feelings about this, if I was to pick, I would come down strongly on Ken's side. And
I think Sabrina had the more persuasive rhetoric.
Yeah, but I don't know if Ken needs persuasive rhetoric, right? Because Sabrina did make a wonderful case, very well written, very persuasive, and I can understand why people agreed with it. Made the argument that like your vote is your investment in our civic society, right? Like, and I get that.
Well, and I also think she made the argument that you have an obligation to vote for what you believe to be the least bad choice, because it's not just about you and your feelings; it's about what serves your community as a whole. I thought that was a persuasive point.
Yeah, but that's the point I disagree with. No, I, as a citizen, my vote is precious, and I will not put it to something that I do not endorse. And I will not endorse least bad. In order for me to take my vote and park it with someone, I have to believe in them. I have to believe, and I don't necessarily mean that in some West Wing way, right? But I actually have to think that this person and the party that they are running with will do good things. And I cannot, in good conscience, I've never been able to vote strategically. I just can't. And like, this might be some weird finicky failure of mine, arguably, I don't know. But parking my vote with the least bad option, no, the hell with you. I will not endorse least bad. I will be a precious little princess, and I will stay home, and I will withhold my vote from you. Now, I've never skipped voting. I have always shown up. I have always, because I think like you have to do your civic duty. And like I will get dressed. I will take my voter card. I will go to the ballot station. I will get my ballot, and I will doodle a starship on it, and then I'll cram the thing into a box. But if I don't like you, I'm not voting for you.
But
And
the end result of that at the collective level is that you're sticking yourself with often the more bad option, which is worse for your community as a whole by
yeah, but
making
then
those choices.
yeah, maybe, but then I'm not part of it. Like I haven't done my part for it.
No, but not choosing is also a choice.
Yeah, it is, and I'm choosing to not endorse shit.
But that doesn't necessarily incentivize better candidates in the future. So it doesn't actually improve anything. And in the
No,
meantime,
it
you're
doesn't.
probably
It
and
probably
then
makes it worse.
it probably makes it worse. And then in
Keeps
the
my hands clean
meantime,
though.
yeah, but I mean, essentially, this comes down to the question of what do you as an individual owe your own integrity versus the owe to your society as a whole.
What good am I to society without integrity?
Well, you can have the integrity of knowing that you didn't saddle your society with a worse option, the worst option.
One of the interesting wrinkles to this debate is I think it depends what is going to happen in your riding. And I have
Oh,
never
totally.
lived in a competitive riding.
Yeah,
And
fair enough.
I have actually lived in ridings that have changed, but it's never been like a squeaker. Like the
Hmm.
ridings I've lived in, when they change, it's a stampede. It
Mhm.
is a throw the bums out stampede where there's like a 12,000 vote swing from liberal to conservative, and then the conservatives hold it for a few terms, and then boom, the liberals are back in. I honestly wonder how I would feel in a situation. Oh, I mean, I also live in Toronto, right? Where up
Mhm.
until his recent flameout, where John Tory was just like crushing every
Mhm.
election, and my municipal counselor, who has actually changed because of district boundary changes,
Mhm.
where the incumbents just win over and over and over. I've never actually been in an election where it was even remotely plausible that my vote would make a difference, which might give me the luxury of being precious in a way that I wouldn't necessarily have if it was every vote could potentially count this year. But
And
I
I
gotta
think
say,
that I
I
think we
agree.
actually
But
are.
fundamentally, I agree with Ken. I will not put my vote with someone because I think you're the least bad option, unless I can actually say on any level I would put my name to this.
Well, you know what? I think that we've actually reached an insoluble philosophical difference because fundamentally, I think this comes down to what extent do you owe your society something more than you owe yourself as an individual and your own feelings as an individual. And
I'm a
I think that that
conservative. I
is,
put me and my family first.
and I'm a woman, so I guess I put my community first. No, but no, but I mean, it's essentially, I think this is a philosophically unbridgeable difference, and I don't think that there's a right or wrong answer.
Yeah, maybe. Um, there have been times where I've considered strategic voting. Like I've thought about like, like maybe can I spank this candidate this time by voting for whoever is in second place, something like
Mm-hmm.
that. I was just talking with friends a couple days ago about the Toronto mayoral election, where it looks like Olivia Chow is cruising to a win with about 30% support.
That's going to be really funny.
Yeah, it's gonna be just a real hoot.
Good luck with that, Toronto.
Yeah, it's
It's going to
thanks.
be great for you.
Things are gonna go fine. It's just like some of the people I'm talking
Relax,
about.
Olivia Chow's going to be fine.
You're gonna regret that. There are people I know talking about some sort of consolidate around second place campaign,
Mhm.
which is basically a week out from the election, figure out who's in second and throw everything behind that person to block Chow.
Mhm.
And yeah, okay, like I understand strategic voting. I understand why people would want to think that, but what if I don't like the second place person? I
Well,
don't
then you
want to
can
I don't want to
just
have a hand in them winning.
you can have a hand at Olivia Chow winning, and good luck with that. Have fun. Whee!
All the choices suck. Um
That's because we live in a broken country.
well, let's talk about that. I'm not ready yet to declare on this because let me you know the backdrop here. Let me give the listeners and the viewers the backdrop. I read a really interesting column a few days ago, and let me open with a disclosure. Anthony Fury, formerly of Post Media, is running to be the mayor of Toronto, and Anthony and I, God, I've known him more than a decade, and we've always gotten along. We're not close friends or anything, but we've always gotten along. He was my opposite at the Toronto Sun. He was the comment pages editor at the Toronto Sun when I was the comment pages editor at the National Post. And we we ran fairly separate shops to an extent that I don't think people realize. The Sun media papers and the traditional Post media broadsheets were very much in different chains of command. So Fury and I didn't overlap a lot, but God knows we've done radio panels together all over the
Yeah,
place for years. I know the
Canadian
guy.
media is small. Everybody
Yeah.
knows each other.
And I've always gotten along with him. And he's running in this election. I don't want to call it a far right, but he's running very much from the right. Like, we're going to clean up the city, we're going to throw the bums out, we're going to fix what's broken. And Ed Keenan in the Toronto Star, in keeping with Toronto being like the Canadian media being tiny, also a guy I know and like, had a column this week where Ed was kind of saying, you know what, I know Fury, like the same thing, and I would never vote for him here. I don't want to recap Ed's column against Anthony. Like, that's if you're interested in it, you can go find it yourself. What I thought was interesting about Ed's column is that Ed was noticing that Anthony's polls are rising, and a month ago, Fury was dead in the polls. Like, he was not even one of the guys the polling companies were tracking, because there's over 100 candidates, and Andrew Tumilty wrote about that a few days ago for us. So the polling companies are only kind of looking at the top 6 or the top 10.
Yeah, makes sense.
And Fury wasn't in that a month ago. Now he is. Now he's kind of really cracked into that. He's still way behind Chow, but he's come way up. And Ed in the Star was kind of wondering why. And he wrote this column where he kind of said, you know, he acknowledged knowing Anthony the same way I have. He said he would never vote for him because their politics are too different. But then Ed kind of asked why is he gaining support? And he made some of the comments that I think are broadly representative of what center or left-leaning people think when they see a conservative succeeding. Ed talked about the fact that Anthony's getting kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink support from old Sun media colleagues. He's getting perhaps more, like, he's getting talked about more on talk radio or in the Sun papers than a candidate polling at like 4% probably should have. And now he's polling at 10%. He also talked about Ed did the kind of the corrosive impact of decades of anti-government rhetoric, and how a guy on the outside like Anthony can come up and go, we're going to sweep the bums out, and there's a ready-made audience for that. He talked about political polarization. He talked about social media. And I'm reading the column. I'm thinking, Ed, you're a smart guy. Please don't make the mistake you're about to, I think you're about to make. Please don't make the mistake. Please. Oh, you made the mistake. His column ends, and what Ed, who is a smartful guy, I read his column. He's not blind to these problems. But the thing he never mentioned in his column about why Anthony Fury might be succeeding is because Fury has a fucking point. And this is not an endorsement, because I don't know who yet I'm going to vote for, but I suspect it won't be for Fury, because I'm skeptical of former columnists becoming politicians. Let's just say I know the type.
we know enough about our own.
Yeah, exactly. But like, I think if you are someone in the center of Canadian politics, or if you're even leaning to the progressive left, and your explanation for every conservative success is like disinformation, anti-government rhetoric, polarization, radicalization, and it never occurs to you that it might also be a reflection of repeated government failure, I don't know what the fuck you're thinking. And I like I said to you at the start, I'm not ready to kind of pronounce on this fully, because I've been sketching out this week. I'm going to write about this next week for us, but I've been sketching out just on my notepad here, which the CGI is blanking out. What are some of the broad indicators of the health of a city that we could track? And I looked at Toronto police crime statistics in almost every category, with the notable and interesting exception of homicide. They're way up.
Mm-hmm.
over looking back 5 years, which is sort of what the Toronto Police Service they update every week and they do a year over year read. How are we
Mm-hmm.
doing on stabbings? How are we doing on assaults? How are we doing on robberies? Homicide's the only one that's down. And it's down just like there's not a ton of people getting murdered in Toronto all the time. So the numbers are susceptible to big swings. And
Yeah. Yeah.
one shootout is going to swing the numbers in a big
Yeah.
way.
Remember, the summer of the gun was
Yeah.
basically one gang war.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
But all of our crime indicators are moving in the wrong direction. And then I looked at homelessness. And homelessness is tricky to track because what we really do track is shelter occupancy. But the thing is, the shelters are always 100% full. So
Right.
you've kind of got to look at other metrics or talk to other experts. But there is no one in Toronto right now who does not think that homelessness is worse. And what's happening is that, like, if you look at the year over year stats on homeless shelter occupancy, it's always fucking 100%. But what's
Mm-hmm.
happening now is that there's a lot of people who aren't in the shelters.
Yeah.
They're
They're
just
sleeping rooms.
unhoused. They're
Yeah.
just under bridges. They're in abandoned buildings. They're in
Yeah.
parks.
Yeah.
So like
And
that's
that
where,
population is notoriously hard to track.
yeah, but we know it's up. Like every
Yeah.
indicator is telling us it's up, and everyone out there on the front lines is telling us it's up. I looked at overdose deaths. Overdose deaths were down last year, but they were down from a massive surge in the early part of the pandemic, and
Right.
even being down last year is 60% higher than 2018.
Right.
I looked at the Toronto Transit Commission stats, which track things like violent incidents on the TTC. You kind of have to you need to set your parameters pretty closely there, because in some categories they're down, but broadly speaking, violent incidents against both passengers and staff are way up. And I'm looking at all of this, and I'm just thinking, like, Ed lives in this city. He's a smart guy. He writes about these issues. There is no one in Toronto right now who's arguing that things are going well. And I haven't even touched on things like traffic congestion, state of good repair, general wear and tear on city-owned resources, access to services, even something as simple as property taxes going up, which you can make
Mm-hmm.
an argument for or against in terms of public policy, but it's going to piss people off, even if it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Nowhere in Ed's column was there any acknowledgement that a guy who comes in from the outside and goes, sweep the bums out, simple law and order based solutions, let's clean up the town. Guys like that don't succeed if people aren't angry about something. And it doesn't matter if he's offering real solutions or if that the anger is going to a healthy place. It has to be part of your understanding about why it's happening. So what I'm going to have ready for sometime next week is going to be a column where I'm pulling together Toronto metrics. Are we heading in the right direction or not? Again, I'm not voting Anthony Furey. I don't vote for columnists because we're broken in very similar ways. But if you don't
Politicians are also broken in not so dissimilar ways. The other thing I would just observe about all of this is that I think this is one of the I don't know, it's a weird tick of progressive politics, and maybe it's because progressive politics is disproportionately assigned to people who are urban and educated, is that for a lot of people in that situation, politics is all an abstraction, right? If something's happening that they don't like, there's an ideological reason for it. It's they themselves are very rarely affected by crime. They're disproportionately less likely to be affected because they're not poor, right? Most progressive, generally speaking, I'm saying very much in generalities, they tend to be wealthier. That means they're less likely to be victims of crime. So they're a little bit more insulated from harder realities of life and the environments in which they live, which gives them it puts people like Keenan in a position where they have the luxury of abstraction, where politics isn't something that's felt, it's something that can be analyzed like a bug under a microscope. If you're actually taking the TTC every day and you're dealing with the crazies, it's a different conversation. Your politics is much more personal, it's much more visceral. You can talk about disinformation, misinformation, all these things that are beautifully abstract and can be studied cleanly from a distance, right? Which is why this set tends to focus on these issues disproportionately, or money in politics, whatever. Again, nothing a nerd likes better than to go through a database and do a database analysis, right?
Like I've been doing with Toronto's health metrics.
Well, that's right. That's exactly right. But I mean, like, or things of that nature. It's a natural thing to go to the abstract when you are of a particular social status, class, and political persuasion. For most people, this is where the disconnect between the elites and the non-elites kind of comes in.
Yep.
Because for
There's
most
the
people,
guy talking about what's happening on the subway versus the guy riding it.
Yeah, essentially, for most people who aren't of the quote unquote elites, and don't, when I talk about elite, I'm not just talking about rich people here. I'm talking about people who are have social capital. So journalists, we're elites, whether you like it or not. Doesn't matter how much we get paid. We have social capital that ordinary people don't have.
I would like to get paid more, but yes, I take it.
Fair enough. Yes. But this is one thing that we are frequently disconnected from, and as a result, we don't feel politics in the same way that your average voter does. Your average voter is not making rational disinterested choices based on a cold analysis of platforms or facts. They're like, things don't feel right now. I don't feel safe getting on the subway.
Yeah.
I don't
like,
or
no, I agree
or from the left, they're making this. I don't like the way that the left is talking and behaving on this particular issue. That makes me feel bad. I'm going to vote for the conservative. Most of politics is purely emotional, purely visceral, and that puts people like you and Keenan and to some extent me, because I'm more excitable than you are, but to a lesser extent me, in this really interesting and probably useless position, because we're analyzing these issues and topics from 1,000 feet down, and we're not feeling them in the same way.
One of the things I've always found interesting about this, and this might be a career advantage, but it has probably been personally off-putting to other people, is that I'm pretty open about viewing all of you like interesting bugs.
Yep.
And I remember someone telling me once, well, it's easy for you to say, living in your wealthy community with your cottage to go to, and you can avoid all these problems. It must be fascinating for you to just look on all our little problems like it's a data set. I was like, yeah. Yeah, it is. Yeah. And someone told me to check my privilege once, and I just told them it's right where I left it. I can't be ashamed about these things. Like I do view these things very much in abstract terms, but I try to remember that I do.
Well, and this is I think one of the key personality difference between you and I is that I live in I think we would be very similar in the Myers-Briggs personality test, but there's one of those particular metrics where the feeling or perception, I'm very empathetic. I know people don't necessarily agree with this. I'm very empathetic. I feel what other people are feeling.
Hey, on my Myers-Briggs, I'm actually an F.
Really? Well, then maybe we're the same. But I navigate a lot of my analysis from my heart first, right? Like, what are people feeling? And sometimes that leads me wrong, but sometimes it doesn't, right?
I'm empathetic with a person, but pretty Vulcan with a society. But I just think, one of the interesting things this week, and I've told you this off the air already, and you were amused by this, but I'll tell the listeners and viewers this now. Well, first of all, earlier this week, one of my best and oldest friends had an unusual incident at work where a homeless person was just in his office and was removed, and everything was okay. But like, my buddy was like, well, that was strange. And then shortly thereafter that, I think either the same day or day after, I had, I guess, I don't want to make it sound like I'm mocking the person, because that would obviously be cruel, but I had a very strange encounter with an individual in Toronto. And the only possible explanation I can give of the incident was that this person, either I was on some sort of candid camera prank show that no one had me sign a waiver for, or I was dealing with someone who is not entirely of sound mind. I had an encounter with someone who was behaving extremely bizarrely. And I just kind of shook it off. I was like, well, that was weird. And like, my buddy was like, well, I guess we need key fobs in the office now. Like, we kind of had very rational reactions to this. But if you are riding the subway to work and there's a guy on the train who is who's just screaming incoherently, that's going to change your politics. And it might not be at a deeply thought out, I'm going to become informed about the issues and learn what more we can do about these systemic multi-causal issues. You might just go, yeah, that fucking sucked, and I never want to do that again. And then you see some YouTube clip of a guy going, I'm going to clean up the streets. And you go, cool. And I think I agree with you. I don't know enough about Ed's personal life to say, I don't know, maybe he
No,
lives in a really crime
and
infested area.
I
But I
could be
agree
totally
with you on
wrong.
the grand
I'm
scheme.
saying generally speaking,
Yeah.
this is the fundamental failure of the elites, is that we don't feel through problems in the same way that ordinary people feel through problems, and it disconnects us
And
from those problems.
that would be okay, I think, to an extent. Probably not ideal, but it would be okay if you were at least honest with yourself enough, not
Yes,
necessarily your podcast listeners, to go, yes, I do view all of you as interesting data
yeah,
sets.
you need to be self-aware of that fact, and too many people simply aren't. They think, no, I'm right, and I'm going to tell you stupid insects what the correct answer is, and I'm going to use my platform, my media, blah blah blah, to brainwash you or inculcate you with the right answer.
I think it's also,
That's
yeah,
deadly wrong
yes.
approach, I think, to people, to humanity, and to the job. But hey, you do you.
I think there's another element to it, though, and I don't think you're wrong, but I think I would add to that. There's also, how many times have we heard some variation of this from someone who's either in the center or the left? I cannot believe these people keep voting against their own interests.
Mm-hmm. As if I am the arbiter of their
Of
interests.
what their interests are, or what should be the top priority in their life.
Yeah, because you know better.
And you don't understand that there are, in fact, a lot of reasons why people vote the way they do. And it could be as simple as once having been really fucking put off by someone saying, why aren't you voting for your interests? And going, well, I think you're an arrogant, smug asshole, and I'm never voting for you. And that becomes a lifelong voting pattern because it doesn't take this long for things to get established. You know, we had I think the election Alberta had just a few days ago is an example of this. The result was fairly predictable, I think.
It wasn't a surprising result. And also, again, from the Navigator data, most people made up their mind before the election. The election actually didn't sway any minds.
And but I saw some smart people who were shocked by the outcome here because they were really emotionally invested in Rachel Notley winning. And I remember during the Ontario election, which was almost a year ago, kind of almost within a couple of weeks of the 1 year anniversary of this, looking at poll after poll after poll, which never really moved, showing that Doug Ford was cruising towards a crushing re-election. And there were people who were shocked by that. And it's just this really interesting thing, which is like, there's this mental block people have, and it's not absent on the right, but I think it's manifesting more right now on the Canadian center or left, which is,
oh yeah, the right,
I would never vote for this
own,
person. How can someone else?
The right has its own issues. We've talked about them at length. So
the right's issue, I think, is particularly where they cannot imagine why anyone would ever vote for Justin Trudeau. And I don't mean that in that they think people should vote for him. I mean, they cannot
fathom why why other people can't see what they can see.
Yeah. And I think that has been something that has been blinding them for a while.
Can't you see what an absolute tool this guy is? What is your problem? What is wrong with you?
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent, that's probably how Trudeau ended up being elected in the first place. I don't think the Conservatives took him seriously until he handed them their lunch.
Yeah.
But I just think, again, there's this weird expectation among a lot of the kind of the center or the left, more so, I would say, more so the progressive bent, which is that this will be the election where the people will vote for the rational policy solution to this intractable social ill. And they'll never occur to them that there's people out there who vote Doug Ford today because 15 years ago, then Councillor Rob Ford helped them with trash pickup.
Well, and also that's not, the left is not the sole arbiter of rational policy making. Like, that's the other problem. I'm sorry, but like, if you're on the left and you're in the progressive and you're an egghead, your assumption is that you know best what the only solutions are to some of these policy, these major complicated social policy problems. And oftentimes you don't.
Yeah.
So many people rely on, frankly, shit data, shit science, and shit studies, but then they hide their totally ideologically driven rhetoric under the guise of evidence-based reasoning or evidence-based policy, and it's not. It just isn't.
And then we're shocked when
Yeah.
almost every violent crime indicator is up, overdose deaths are up.
Yeah.
Your column a few weeks ago, in a different context, actually
Is
really
this
meaningfully.
what failure looks like? Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I would even phrase it differently than that, because you asked the question, is this what failure looks like? I posed a similar version of that question this week, which was the opposite, which is, can someone please tell me what we're trying to do?
Yes.
And it was
Okay.
also on the issue. It was an Ontario story, so it wasn't related to the Vancouver stuff that you'd been writing about, but it was also on drug policy, which is, I just want someone to tell me. And I wasn't even like, I wasn't fighting. It was like, is anyone in a position of authority able to tell me what the goal is here? Do we have one?
No.
Is the goal, is it fewer overdose deaths? Is it getting more people into treatment? Is it
No,
fewer
it's
people
safe
living with
supply,
addiction?
because safe supply is the answer. Don't you understand? It's all circular logic. It's
Yeah.
circular reasoning.
And if
The science shows us that safe supply is the correct answer to the problem of drugs. So safe supply is obviously the answer, and we'll know we will know we'll have succeeded when we have safe supply.
and then and in the meantime, people who question that just want to see addicts dead in parks.
You've just been misinformed by disinformation. Why don't you vote in your own interests, which in this case is obviously safe supply?
And then there's more, you know, again, like I've lived in Toronto or in its 905 suburbs my entire life. And the area of the city I live in is not the kind of place where we're dealing with a lot of needles and parks. We're like, I'm in the more suburban Midtown area, and those problems have traditionally been a bit more in the downtown core. But actually just seeing outright drug paraphernalia on the streets, even in downtown areas where you'd kind of always see some of that, you're seeing more of it. And I was saying to someone yesterday
That's
that
just conservative propaganda, Matt.
what Toronto is dealing with now is not unprecedented for Toronto, but we're dealing with more of it, and it's popping up in areas where it didn't used to be. And I might have mentioned this. I don't know if I told you this or not on our last podcast, but my son, as you know, he plays hockey, and I recently found a homeless guy living in a tent between the two snowbanks left by the Zamboni in a part of the city where you never would have seen homeless before. And even in my neighborhood, which again is a little bit isolated from these problems, we used to have like a homeless guy. Now we have a couple of homeless guys, and they don't always get along with each other. Have I seen crazy people in Toronto before? Yeah. Have I ever had an encounter like I had just a couple of days ago? No. Yeah, and I just think, I don't know. I'm not sure I disagree with Ed Keenan about misinformation and self-reinforcing
No, and
social media echo chambers and all that stuff.
That's the thing, is that, like, I don't disagree with that. Yeah, I don't even disagree that all of this stuff is active and part of the conversation, and the echo chambers are part of this conversation. But again, misinformation and echo chambers are not confined to the conservatives. They're not only utilized by the conservatives. Like, let's get out, pull your head a little bit out of your ass here. And also, the other interesting thing about echo chambers and moral panics and hysterias is that they're never rooted in fantasy. They don't work if they're totally rooted in fantasy.
Anthony Furey's not running on a unicorn cull.
No. Like, there's a reason why these messages work and are effective when they are. And often it's because, however amplified or perhaps even exaggerated some of the echo chamber and disinformation stuff is happening, it's not made up.
I had an opportunity recently. I can't put everything on the record here, but I did have an opportunity recently to have an interesting conversation with someone who's very much on the front lines of the addictions crisis in the city of Toronto, and some of the surrounding areas as well, not limited to the 416. And it's never been worse.
Big surprise.
But you bring that up, and well, it's people don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about ecosystems and stuff like that. And I honestly believe, more than needles and buses or playgrounds, or more than violence on the subway and things like that, I really think what radicalizes people is when they see smart people refusing to talk about the things that are just plain,
oh God, yes,
to our eyes here.
Yeah.
So,
because there's nothing that actually break. You can talk. There's nothing that breaks down trust than when your experts are saying things that you know are categorically false,
or are refusing to talk about the
or
things that are
refusing to
obvious.
talk about the things that are obvious.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing that will
I
break
think it's more
down.
the
And
latter.
yeah, I think you're right.
Like, yeah, I mean, have I seen like needles on the bus before? Yeah. Like, I ride transit in one of North America's largest cities. I see weird shit when you're doing that. Have I seen violence before? Yeah, of course. I've seen bar fights. I've seen people get smashed up, but there's just more. And it's not an unreasonable thing to want to talk about that. And to the extent we talk about it at all, we smother it in nuance, which is, well, it's a complicated multi-systemic issue. Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, like every reasonable person understands that. But what does failure look like and what does success look like here? No one wants to talk about that.
Mhm.
And someone sooner or later comes along and goes, I'm an outsider, and I'm going to fix it by putting cops on every corner. We're going to clean the parks and we're going to double security on the transit system. And if that's the only fucking person talking about it, that person's going to do okay.
Yep, that's right.
So anyway,
and that's the good solution, because things only get darker from there, but we don't need to get into that.
well, if that doesn't work, that's when someone else comes along and goes, well, that didn't work, so I'm gonna shoot the bastards.
Yeah, essentially this goes outside the institutional pathways. So
I
anyway,
would believe, and maybe I should, you know what? You just gave me an interesting idea. I'm gonna dare throw myself into the maw of the Toronto Police Service's media response machine, which is effectively to say I'm going to have a frustrating next few days. Remember that when was it, like last month, that guy on the New York subway was killed?
mhm.
I wonder if there's been an uptick in attacks on homeless people in Toronto. Anecdotally, there have been reports about that. Like, it's been in the news, but I wonder if I just would worry that the Toronto police might not actually break down their reported crime statistics in a way that you can kind of just pull that information out. But I'll ask.
Well, you'll ask. Anyway, we should probably put a pin in that because we've been rambling on.
Yep. Okay. Well,
Cool.
that was a typically uplifting podcast. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
You too.